So did you grow up in California?
I did, yeah. Born in LA. Yeah, I've lived here my entire life.
What are you
Uh,
thinking about the state? Man, I have such mixed views. I love this state, and I would tell people, hey, there are more people who voted for Trump in California than any state in the union, I believe, except for Texas and maybe Florida.
Maybe Florida, yeah.
But that said, it's still crazyville when it comes to state government and the things they do. I mean, it's such a beautiful place to live, and there's just so much crap going on that it makes me want to punch my face.
It's the state is, I think, too big now. I think it's I used to think that the movement to split California into 4 or 5 different states was a bit crazy, but now I'm not so sure.
Yeah, no, I'd
Actually,
live up in, what do they call the northern area? Freedomville
oh,
or Jackson?
state of Jefferson.
State of Jefferson. I was close.
Jefferson.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'd actually move up to Jefferson if I got to be like tied into Idaho, southeast
Right.
part of Oregon, and a couple of the others. But I don't know.
Well, I wonder. Like I said, I've lived here all my life, and I'm 50 years old. I wonder how much longer I'll be able to stay. It's with every year there's just something, one more damn thing, right?
Right.
And but I think the big thing would be if, and this isn't, there's a people all over the country who are going to be listening to this, but California in 1978 passed a ballot initiative called Proposition 13 that put a cap on the growth of property taxes. So California has probably one of the highest income tax rates in the country. I think Connecticut and Hawaii might be higher, but we have probably one of the highest income tax rates, and other taxes are very high. Gas taxes are very, very high, but property taxes are near the bottom in the country. And what would happen if that were to ever go away is that people with, you know, people on fixed incomes, for example, like my mother, who's lived in the same house since 1966, who has a pretty cool tax rate, would see her taxes go through the roof.
But wait a second. But Prop 13 only grandfathers in people who were there at the time that Proposition 13 passed, right? I mean, Proposition 13,
right. So,
it's got a few other little provisions, a 2/3 and some other things. But I mean, I keep paying more property tax every time I either buy and sell a house,
correct.
or they can just redo it. So it's only people who owned a house in 1976. So what percentage of the state does that affect?
Ooh, I'm not sure. I really don't know. But what it would mean in practice, though, Ken, is that the state and local governments would no longer be restrained with the rate of growth.
Right.
So there would be tax competition. Jurisdictions wouldn't want to jack up property taxes too quickly or too much too soon, but they wouldn't be limited to the, I think, 1% a year that they're limited to now. But yes, as you say, if you sell a house and then you buy a new house, you're taxed based on, the new value of that house. So, but my mom's lived in this place since 1966. My parents bought it for $48,000, and it could sell for quite a bit more than that.
It's a tough one because it's kind of like rent control.
Right.
And, you talk to somebody living in New York or San Francisco and they're like, yeah, I pay $400 a month for my
Right.
my apartment. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I'm paying $4,000 a month for, 1,400 square feet.
Yeah.
And in one hand, it's an unfairness to people who've been around that long. On the other hand, the concept of, okay, your mom moved into a house and then the house value appreciated. So she's probably
Right.
got some dough into that, unless she's gotten taken some money out of that.
No.
But the concept of somebody having to sell their house because the taxes were too high.
Well,
that's a little icky, right?
Were you here in 78? I was a
so
child.
76, right? 76,
So
78? Well, look, I was 11 and 12 years old when this thing passed, and it was a terrific lesson because I realized at a young age all these politicians are full of shit. So like I was there and everybody was like, well, Proposition 13 passes. You know what we have to do? We have to first fire all the police, and we're stopping, we're not gonna have firefighters put out fires anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember my marching band. I was in junior high at the time. My band teacher, that was the seminal event. I was a band geek, and he was like, "Well, no more marching band, no more this, and it's all going." And I went to my dad, and I was like, "Dad, we're not going to have marching band." He's like, please, I could send you to private school for as much money as I'm going to save on this thing. So right. He was kind of like, yeah, they're full of prunes in the way that a 60-year-old guy could do back then. But then he was right. It was like it passed, and you know what changed? It was like, yeah, kind of nothing. I mean, things changed, but there was no the police still came when you dialed 911.
Right.
The fires, they still squirted water on buildings on fire. So
they figured out ways to finance.
They figured sources. Out exactly. So that's when I first realized, people who are screaming about doomsday are often just full of crap.
Right. But remember the impetus for the thing in the first place was that people were losing their homes.
Yeah, sure.
They couldn't pay. They were going, the state was seizing their properties. And that had to do with a lot of, then that was a lot of elderly people in practice. And so I think about that, and I would hate to see that calamity befall my mom, who's in her 80s and shouldn't have to worry about this nonsense.
Right.
But there's a lot of,
or she refinances and pulls $500,000 out of her 1,200 square foot Temple City house.
Frankly, I would, at that point, I would say, you know what, this state is no longer hospitable.
But the problem is, have you looked around for someplace else? Because they also have California has a lot of shit going for it when push comes to shove. Sure. It's like my son just moved to Tennessee. Mainly because of politics, taxes, gun rights, all that stuff. He wants to start a business. He's like, every time he turns around, they put an extra problem on the business, and then if you finally succeed, they steal more than everybody else. But I don't think I can deal with 98% humidity in July, August, September. It's just like, okay, and mosquito. I can't handle mosquitoes. I got type O blood. They suck the life out of me. Every time I look at that, California still comes on top to me.
California has, yes, the weather is a big, big factor. And, I live in the mountains now. And so I live just a little smidge over 6,000 feet. And so I get snow. We're expecting snow on Christmas Eve. I had 4 inches of snow in my driveway last week. Right. So I like the mountains. And so I look at a state like Idaho where lots and lots of Californians are moving, but may not be prepared for the weather. And I think to myself, well, maybe after the bloom, falls off of that rose for a lot of transplants, and they realize, oh my God, I've got to shovel snow. It's -10 outside. We're going to Arizona.
So Idaho is my Zillow porn.
Yes.
I'll go on to that. Although, even in the last couple of years, I'd say, okay, for X amount of dollars, what can I buy there? And that's gone down a lot as all the Californians flee there. Yeah. And it's like, okay, as I'm looking at it, it's like southeast part of Idaho, it doesn't look too much fun. Even the southwest part of Idaho doesn't look all that fun. For me, it's either go the expensive, snobby, liberal place, which is Sun Valley,
right,
and just one of the most beautiful places in the world, or I go with men and I move up to Sandpoint and the Panhandle.
I've been concentrating my search on between Sandpoint and Bonners Ferry, which is right on the Canadian border.
Yeah, but man, you got to have balls made of steel to live there. I'm
up for it.
I'll come and visit you to try it out. I have a cousin, one of my very favorite cousins, who in the 70s, 80s lived in LA. Had a good drywall business, and was just like, you know what? Nope, I'm moving to Idaho, and I'm going to build myself a log cabin. Found a woman who thought the same way as him. Went up there, literally cut the tree. Spent all his money, sold his business, and bought just some land up there. Stripped the trees, cut the trees, built himself up a log cabin. no water. I mean, had to go drive in his truck and have a 55-gallon drum to bring the water up for the first 3 or 4 years, and it was like, he had to shoot what he ate. I mean, when he ran out of money, it was like it was wilderness time, like the crap you and I read about in the Daniel Boone times. And
that man's name, Randy Weaver.
No, he probably has more guns than Randy Weaver ever had. His name's Dave Gullo. He runs he was one of the best. Do you know what black powder cartridge rifle shooting is?
Oh yeah.
He has Buffalo Arms. And so for those who don't know, black powder cartridge is it was the era before, the Davy Crockett thing where you would pour the powder in there and bite off the wad and then put the bullet in. It was a cartridge, but it was still that same old black powder that caused huge puffs of smoke. So you'd see that kind of Civil War time. You'd see them fire it and the smoke comes out of here. And he was like it wasn't Guinness Book of World Records. He was on the one of those other shows like that of hitting a target at like a mile distance. I mean, he was an amazing shooter on that. And now he's got a company up there that produces and sells parts for black powder cartridge. Perfect thing for living in Idaho, and the last guy you want to fuck with.
Yeah, right. That's the thing. You got a lot of independent-minded people up there. You have people who want to govern themselves and who want to be more or less left alone, but they also have strong communities up there. There's a lot of religious folk up there. My mother, you mentioned the southeast part of the state. That's where my mom grew up.
Oh, okay.
In a little town called Grace, which I think the population is still 900 and change. It was 900 and change in the 1930s. They have one bar, they have one restaurant, they have one grocery store. If you want to, and not a very good grocery store. If you want to actually get supplies, you have to drive about an hour to Pocatello.
Right.
And
is she or was she Mormon? Because I want to say the state's about a quarter Mormon. Okay. Yeah,
she is. I'm not. She and we still have.
That must have been some tough conversations.
Well, it was. Yeah, it actually was, and occasionally is. She's very serious. After my dad passed away, she got very serious about church again, which was great for her. I mean, when you suddenly find yourself widowed after almost 60 years of marriage, you got to put your attention and energy into other things, preferably not staying at home doing nothing.
Right.
So she's very serious with that. But what I love about the Mormons and what I love about that little community of Grace is that, the problem with small towns is everybody knows what's going on, but the virtue of small towns is everybody knows what's going on. And I kind of, the last time I was there, we were walking up Main Street with my, one of my cousins, and it was like he was the mayor of the place.
Right.
He knew every single person. And there's something really kind of lovely about that and attractive.
Yeah, I don't know how I'd feel about that. I can see the advantages, but on the other hand, there's something nice to people not knowing who I am. Just generically in life. I don't know if I like the average person that much. I like the people I like. I like you. Right. I like that guy, but you guys go fuck off. I don't know.
Think of it this way, Ken. If you and I were to do something like this, we would like the communities that we lived in, but we would also have 40 acres and a gate.
Right.
Right.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Look, I was so proud of what Sandpoint in that area did during the whole BLM riots. When they had a big group coming in one day, from Spokane,
right,
which isn't all that far away, and there were a lot of people meeting them down there with AR-15s.
Yeah.
That did two things and did them both equally well from what I can gather. One was, we are protecting your right to protest and to put your fist in the air and to scream and shout and call for the change in our government that you want to call for. And number two, you're not fucking breaking any windows or burning anything down in this town, or you're all going to die.
That's right.
And it was kind of, I wish Kenosha had done that. I wish Kenosha hadn't had so many people stay at home that a 17-year-old kid had to go out there and do the job of the police force and do the job of the fire department. It was like, what do you do when you're in a situation like that, when your government abdicates its responsibilities for whatever reasons? And these ones, I think, were largely political, and somewhat we got overwhelmed.
And the police really, I mean, unfortunately, the police really made that situation worse, because if you recall, really what happened was the main BLM protest was sort of in downtown Kenosha, and that's not where Rittenhouse and his friends were. That's not where the business was. And essentially what the cops did was they drove the protesters in that direction. So,
again, it was the third night of things just burning to the ground and people losing. I mean, it's a simplistic attitude for people to be like, well, insurance picks that up. It's like, yeah, have you ever put an insurance claim in? Usually you get boned 16 ways till Sunday, right? They're like, well, fire. That's a subclause 3. There's a $40,000 deductible on that, and we pay out over 30 years. I mean, these are the guys that write thick contracts to not pay you back. That's what the insurance company does.
You know how a lot of these businesses got burned? I mean, figuratively burned. Some insurance companies considered what happened terrorism, and that's a separate policy.
Wow. Have you guys done a story on that?
Did we have I think we had a story about that last year. And I've seen stories about it elsewhere, that terrorism insurance is a thing, but it's a very expensive thing. And that's why most people don't get it, because the chances of you becoming a victim of a terrorism attack are very, very, very low.
Unless we define everything as terrorism.
It seems like we're expanding that definition quite a bit.
It drives me crazy when conservatives do that. Look, I'm actually tougher on my own group than I am on the other. It's like, yeah, those guys are assholes and idiots, but we should be smarter than this. When they're like, well, you need to call these smash and grabs terrorism. It's like okay, I understand that you want to call it something bad, and it's real, not just bad, but really, really bad. But linguistically and legally, there's probably a good reason to divide the guy who runs into a Nordstrom and steals some crap and runs out versus somebody who tries to blow up a plane. Right. Call me soft on crime. I don't know.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that the voters in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles bear a certain responsibility for electing officials who said very clearly what they plan to do, that they would not prosecute certain quote unquote low level crimes.
It's crazy. And look, we're the dumbasses that voted for a proposition that in California that made it a misdemeanor if you stole under $950 worth of shit.
Well, I didn't vote for the thing, but yes.
But a majority of our brethren did.
A sizable majority.
But you know what? Because you get those things, and there's even though the state constitution and law says that it has to be narrowly focused, it's often not. So you get something that says it's reforming the political justice system, and you got to dig into it. And it's difficult as a voter because, you try to say, okay, well, who's on what side? Well, everybody has nonprofits that pretend like they're on one side, even though they're the other. So we're a citizens committee to keep Californians safe by allowing every criminal to get out of Dodge. I mean, so it's tricky when it's long and complicated, and those ballots are too difficult for the average person to spend the proper amount of time to deal with.
So state officials and Jerry Brown were in a bit of a pickle with the state prisons, because about 10 years ago now, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision that said California's prisons, in particular their healthcare system, amounts to cruel and unusual punishment, because the prisons were overcrowded. You had people with legitimate medical needs that were not being met, and you had prisoners sleeping in hospital wards and things like that. And so there was a big lawsuit, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, California can't do this anymore. And so the state then passed a bill that put a lot of state prisoners into county jails. So all of a sudden, the burden is on counties to.
That was pretty recent, right?
Yeah, that was.
Like
That was
4 years ago,
5, 6 years ago, something like that. And so, what happened was that DAs started to selectively use their prosecutorial discretion to not prosecute certain crimes.
Right.
So in January of 2013, I was sitting in a Starbucks in inland Southern California, writing an email to a state senator. I was working on a story, and I needed to talk to her. When all of a sudden somebody bangs into my table, and the next thing I know, I look down, my computer's not there, and the guy's booking it for the front door. And I gave chase, and I even got my hands on the getaway driver, but I couldn't do anything because his window was partly up, and so I couldn't do anything to him. And so all he could do was smile at me and hit the gas, and off he went with my laptop, which was one of several that they had stolen. They were just picking off places that were freeway close. Anyway, to make a long and very sad story short, there were 4 guys involved. They only prosecuted one. That guy didn't get any jail time. He went to something like.
He got caught.
Yeah, they did ultimately get caught like a few weeks later.
Right. Okay.
I never got my laptop back. They told me I could file for restitution. I asked the guy, "Am I going to get it?" He said, "Probably not." And so that was the very beginning of that. And that was in 2013. 2014 is when you started seeing a rise in like vehicle thefts and other petty property crimes. Well, that was because the district attorney in San Bernardino, who at the time was a decent guy, but their hands were really kind of tied because of all these state prisoners that were filling up the county jails. And so that's the reason why that state ballot initiative came about. And so I got into a big fight with Tom Campbell. It was a cordial, but it was a big cordial fight.
He's a nice guy.
Tom Campbell was a former congressman. He ran for U.S. Senate. I think he ran for governor. A
very pleasant and soft man.
Yes, he is. Very nice man and a Republican who just sincerely believed in his heart of hearts that we're putting too many people away for petty drug crimes. Right. And surely we can reform the statutes so that certain felonies become misdemeanors, so we keep our prison populations down and we don't have these nonviolent drug offenders filling up, necessary beds. And I said, what's going to happen is, well, exactly what has happened, which is that if you don't prosecute for petty offenses, you're going to, in time, see larger offenses.
Sure.
And the other thing about petty offenses is petty offenses aren't that petty.
Right.
My laptop was considered grand theft.
Yeah, 949. Go fuck yourself, pal.
Right. And so, but that cost me a bit of money. I had to write a few extra pieces to pay off the new computer for that one. Right.
Sure.
So I don't believe in petty crimes. I believe in being judicious about punishing people. Mm-hmm. I don't think we should have mandatory minimum sentences. And
until you've lived through an era where the judges
let everybody go.
No,
I think that when we have judges who are too lenient, right? I think we need to have better judges. I see the problem with mandatory minimums is, you have somebody who had an accident,
100%.
And goes and has to be sentenced to 110 years in prison, which happened, I think, in Colorado, just recently. Colorado or Minnesota, one of those.
But it's all a cycle because mandatory minimums came about because judges were just such pussies,
right?
And letting guys go. Oh well, but he wrote a poem in prison, so I'm letting him out. Right. And I've seen this happen. I mean, in the late 70s, late 70s, crime in California was out of control.
Sure,
I mean, it was substantially higher than it is right now. And you know what? This was a national problem. I want to say it was beyond just California at that point.
That's right.
And but then what happens when people get their laptops ripped off? Or I sat in a courtroom one time, and it was a guy this guy loves stealing Volkswagens. Do you remember the old Volkswagens,
Sure.
the bugs? He
Yeah.
was like a freaking pervert. He just couldn't stop stealing. And the judge was like, you were here last 3 weeks ago for this. You were here 2 months ago, and the judge literally is like, I don't know what to do with you. And I'm kind of like, even as a teenager, I'm like, well, I got one idea. Maybe put him in a cage for a little bit and see what happens. And then people get fed up, and they start electing people who start talking about tough on crime and this and that. And then all of a sudden you get the 3 strikes, you get mandatory minimums, you get something that can easily be abused, but what do you call it when somebody's using drugs and you get to take his house and his yacht and his car?
Asset seizures.
You get all that stuff because people are like, I'd just like to go to the park and not have to worry about my, getting my shit stolen.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. And, we did have briefly a remedy that other states still have, but Proposition 47 really
what was that?
Kneecapped the drug courts. And what the drug court, these were special courts set up for drug offenders. And the idea was they would offer you a carrot and a stick.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, we will give you probation of a certain period of time, say 2 years, 3 years, whatever. But if you will go to rehab, and you will stick with rehab, and you will show us that you're making progress and that you're attempting to find gainful employment, or you have a job. And if you violate any of these terms, we are going to send you away. And so a lot of people who ended up in drug court were people who got arrested for petty theft, shoplifting, those low-level, quote unquote, low-level property crimes, but they were also where there was a drug offense attached to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so they were able to successfully intervene. I mean, the drug courts actually worked. And when Proposition 47 passed, which made all of these crimes either, in some cases, felonies to misdemeanors and misdemeanors to infractions, then the drug courts lost their teeth, which was a great shame, because that really did help.
I'm a believer that there is you mentioned the phrase carrot and stick, and it's kind of how life works, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you think of a kid being raised, and for the most part, the best way to raise a kid is a mom and a dad, or someone with feminine characteristics and somebody with masculine characteristics. So when the kid falls on her knee as she's running to say hi to somebody and she's crying, the mom picks her up and wipes off the blood and kisses her. And if she's still crying at a certain point, the dad's like, "Hey, walk it off."
Right.
Enough.
Right.
Stop that. And I've noticed a correlation between the cities that have a lot more nice feminine characteristics versus the sometimes tougher masculine characteristics, and like homelessness and crime. I mean, it's the nice cities. It's go down the coast. It's Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco. It's not Salt Lake City. It's not Dallas, but it is Austin. I mean, when you start to look at the homeless and kind of the breakdown of civilization in some societies, you see very, very nice people who are loving and kind. I mean, look, Santa Monica in California was amongst the first of and they had a lot of homeless kitchens, of course, right up on the bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Sure. And I was like, and so I do think that's an analogy that kind of carries through public policy sometimes.
Well, and you can also extrapolate that to entire states, because it's not just that LA and San Francisco and Santa Ana and San Diego have homeless problems. There are homeless people in this little town where I live right now. There's only 2 of them. And
so what happens to those 2? They're obviously not sleeping in tents on the main street. I mean,
so that's a good question, because just a few weeks ago, there was a woman who was living in the post office, and she was only there for about 2 weeks before. So the county sheriff here has a homelessness response team, and several people called in about this woman who was in the post office. And I think they eventually, what they do is they find you someplace down the hill that's a shelter, and they get you into some kind of program.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times, what you have are, you know, these camps in these in canyons and washes, and in particular, there have been, let me think, this year there were 6 or 7 brush fires that were started by these homeless camps
Who were out there cooking dinner.
Yeah.
Or, right.
and a breeze came up, and or
Right.
wind came up, and
Right.
yeah, and
Who would have thought that homeless people could sometimes be dumb shits?
well,
Hey, it's windy out here. You know, I want some coffee. Whoa, hey.
that has happened more times than you may realize.
I know, you know, yeah. I mean, I'm laughing, which I shouldn't be, but there was one big Malibu fire that it was also, you know, just dumb shit, camper / homeless / whatever you shouldn't have been cooking that night.
Right. And so we're a nice state. We're a very, very nice state, and we're very, very nice to people who probably in many cases need a lot more tough love than what they're getting.
And tough love's a good word for it, because it's like, you know, you think of, so I live in Sausalito. It's a very, very nice place right north of the bridge of San Francisco. And not too long ago, 4 months ago, one of the county preacher types who is big on homeless rights and whatnot basically pushed and helped a camp start up in one of our parks. All of a sudden, well, no, it was actually on private property, but by the time everybody turned around, there was a dozen tents there. A judge saying, well, COVID, blah, 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 you know, there's extra rules on this. So the city felt like they had their hands tied. The city officials are nice people.
Sure.
And it's like, when you ask yourself, when you look at like some of these homeless encampments, if your child was in one of them, your 25-year-old child, let's say, not a little kid, what would you do different? And how would you run those things? How would you certainly wouldn't want your kid, somebody you loved, living there forever, right? I mean, that's a bad thing. So you would want the safety net of not freezing to death, not starving to death, not being bludgeoned by whomever's going to bludgeon them. But you'd also want them to make sure that there was no drugs in those camps, right, and them to make sure that the raping and beating and all, you know, all that stuff was actually that there was some semblance of government order in those. It's a tricky thing, but tough love is what a parent does. Yeah,
and that's and policymakers, for whatever reason, they're I don't know, I don't really understand the mentality other than that the problem is awash in money. And so that's how you get these follies, like the city of Venice in Southern California, building a homeless, I guess it's not a shelter, it's homeless apartments. It's basically supposed to be transitional housing for homeless people on this prime piece of Venice real estate, right next to the boardwalk, at a cost of $500,000 per unit. And the punchline really is that they're building these units at an exorbitant price, and they're doing none of the things, the common sense things that you just suggested a minute ago. Right. They're not saying you can't bring drugs in or alcohol in. They're not clean and sober places.
You know, part of it is, I think we've lost the linguistic battle, and we've called it homeless. And clearly they don't have homes. They don't have a lot of shit. They don't have showers. They don't have, they don't have a job. They don't have the proper amount of dealing with mental health professionals. They don't have the, so I wonder if we should have come up with a better name, because when you see somebody who's half crazy on the best of days, right, you throw in some drugs in there, and they're now 95% sleeping on the streets, screws up your head, and dealing with society, and then we call it
homeless like a home is the solution. I mean,
Right.
but literally, it's like if San Francisco rents dropped in half tomorrow, the homeless population would not be affected.
Right.
If you gave all of those people a free apartment, within 2 years, 80% of them would have sold the pipes. They would have crapped in the corners. They would have done all of they would have fed back into the problems in their life, which is well beyond not having a house. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's one of our problems, is the linguistic way that we approach this problem.
I don't know what the word would be, but I do think that much of the problem is a mental illness problem.
Yeah.
You know, I have a very an old friend from college who was at one time, he was a professional photographer. He worked for news. He was a graphic designer too. He worked for Newsweek, worked for the New York Post. But he's also paranoid schizophrenic.
Right.
And he is living somewhere in San Diego now.
Right.
And just before COVID happened, he reached out to a friend of mine. We all went to UC San Diego together. This friend of mine is a assistant U.S. attorney in San Diego, and reached out to him by email somehow, probably from a library or something,
mm-hmm.
and asked to meet. And my friend told me that, you know, he doesn't look well, but that he was clearly not on his meds and was talking crazy. And we found out that he lives in a shelter, but we couldn't actually reach him. And what I learned pretty quickly from that whole thing, because my friend has the law enforcement resources. I said, "Is there anything you can do to?" And his hands were tied. Everybody's hands seemed to be tied, mm-hmm. because we have said that individuals, even mentally ill individuals, who are not necessarily a clear danger to themselves or others, mm-hmm. but they're still obviously in a really, really bad place, we can't do anything for them.
That's a tough call too, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, freedom's a pretty big thing in this country.
And as you said before, just like with, the pendulum on law and order, there was a lot of abuse in
the mental health things and the
involuntary commitment.
Right.
And there was good reason to reform that.
Mm-hmm.
But to this,
it's tough.
No,
it's tough. How much freedom do you give? How much freedom does an American deserve? That's a tricky question, right? I mean, that's one of the fundamental, and the answer to America has been a lot of freedom. But what do you do when they're not living the life? I mean, a certain percentage of the homeless that I've seen, and one of the reporters at Fox News had a father who was homeless in San Diego, a guy who was a lawyer, had if not a big firm, ran a firm, was well known in town, in a southern town, and obviously there was some things that weren't firing properly in his brain, but a lot of it is he just didn't want to listen to anybody. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, you're offering free soup over there, but I have to say a prayer or do no. I decide not to. I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to listen to this. I don't want to look at red lights. I mean, it was a very much screwed up, but sense of individualism. And, at what point is it proper to say, no, we as a society have decided we know how to live your life better for you, and you have to do X, Y, and Z? God,
well, every single law that's ever been passed and ever going to be passed is essentially an answer to that question.
Kind of. I mean, most laws that are passed are not to protect you from you. They're to protect you from me, and vice versa.
Sure.
I mean that's 98% of the laws, besides motorcycles on helmet and all those things. How much should the state protect Ben from Ben?
I think when you have instances where you have people who, I think, first of all, it is a scandal that a prosperous nation like ours allows anybody to sleep on the street. People who can't take care of themselves, people who are clearly mentally ill, people who are,
Yeah, that's true.
There has to be a way, because these are sick people, sick in a way that, as time has gone on, I'm very glad that much of the stigma surrounding mental illness has fallen away or is still falling away.
We still have a lot of ways to go.
Because it's just not like, if you say to a depressed person, "Hey, buck up, camper,"
right,
that doesn't work. I mean, there's a problem there.
And too often, despite my libertarian rant a second ago, it's like, if you were in downtown LA and you tripped and you hit your head on the sidewalk and you were bleeding out of your head, people would surround you. They would call 911. They would help you out. You would the apparatus of the state and of your neighbors and of strangers would help you.
Right.
You have something fucked up inside your head where you're seeing life at 2/3 of an angle, and I'll never forget when I was planning to move to San Francisco and saying, okay, well, where do I live? I could live here. The world was my oyster, right? It was post-divorce. Right. I was starting brand new, and I sat and I saw a guy in a wheelchair, and obese, black guy, probably in his late 60s, had a couple shopping bags that looked new, was in a wheelchair, and kind of slumped down the whole time, and obviously in mental distress or some type of distress. And no one did anything, including me. I was sitting eating my sandwich. I was just watching this scene, and for like 20 minutes, he was just sitting there, and people were walking by. I'm going to savetheworld.com, right? It was like, so it's like I'm living I'm going to move to this city where are some of the brightest people in the world, are some of the most forward-thinking, some of the nicest people in the world, even when they're befuddled and silly. Some, streets that could be paved with gold, given the amount of money that has been made in San Francisco. And I'm watching this guy drooling on himself, and I'm like, I can't do that. I can't live in that environment. Now, if I was a better person, maybe I'd say I'm going to live there and I'm going to fix it. But it's interesting. When I say, you look 100 years ago and say, how could you people think that little girl, because she's black, deserved to make your clothes and you could beat her and she was a chattel, literally a piece of property to you? How do I get into that headspace? And part of me thinks that in 100 years, people are going to look at us and say, how could you let somebody who had a mental illness sit out on that street and sleep out overnight? That something was wrong with your society at that point.
I think you're probably right. And I hope we get to a point where we can figure out the right balance between those individual freedoms that we so cherish as Americans, and in some cases potentially violating those freedoms for
a greater good, which
I
hate to say, because
I know
usually that's the fucking commies. Like,
that's right.
Well, it's for the greater good.
Right.
Give me your car.
But the greater good is having a society and a civilization where you don't have people suffering in the streets.
Yeah. I mean, it's hidden, and so it's just difficult to see. You're not bleeding out of your head.
Right.
And people who are often mentally ill, or people who are mentally ill, are often, if you evaluate them on like not being mentally ill, they're often assholes.
Right.
you hate to say that, but it's like, somebody's screaming at you for something banal, or they often act in ways that if you don't say, wait, whoa, okay, this person isn't, their brain's not working right, you quickly come to that guy's why is he screaming? Why is he throwing rocks at cars, or whatever that clearly antisocial behavior might be. And if you're not the type of person who, and I don't think most of us are, who can say, yeah, he's throwing rocks at cars, but that's not because he's a jerk. It's because he's got something wrong with him,
Right.
in a different way. I don't know. That's tough.
Right. Which is, and untangling the mental illness from the criminality, right? You know, it's said that I think Rikers Island in New York is the largest mental health facility in the United States.
It's very possible.
Yeah. So it's a lot of these things are tangled up, and it's tough to untangle them.
Especially when you mention criminality. I mean, a lot of people say, hey, certain crimes, certain criminal concepts are mental illness. Somebody who is sexually attracted to children.
Sure.
All right. That is a mental screwed up thing until you act on it, and then it's a pretty bad crime. Right. And it's like, when it's like, how do you classify those things? How do you fix those things? How do you be tough on bad behavior when you need to be tough, but not understanding the essence of it? I don't know.
So when I was an editorial writer at the Press Enterprise in Riverside, California, 15 years ago, this was about the time when, I don't remember if it was a ballot initiative or a state law, limited where convicted sex offenders could live.
Mm-hmm.
So we have every state has a registry of sex offenders, but this particular law went a little bit farther and said, if you're convicted of certain sex crimes, you cannot live within, I think it was like 1,000 feet of a school or a park,
right.
Which kind of really limited where a lot of folks could live. And so we had a Republican state legislator in for an editorial meeting, and this came up, and he said,
who was that? Do you remember?
I don't.
Wasn't Jim Batten, was it? He was bigger.
No, it wasn't Batten. It was.
All right. I only cared if it was Jim.
Anyway, he was down. I think he was down out of Corona.
Right.
And we asked him this question. Well, what do you do then? Because obviously they've got to live somewhere. And he said, and this idea sounds absurd, but it kind of tickled my fancy because it is sort of practical. He said, well, what if we were to build them like a colony?
Keep going.
Like he said, we could do it in the desert maybe, or we could do it maybe out on Catalina or one of those islands out.
Not Catalina.
Out like the Channel
Islands. Give them Santa Cruz, or those ones that we're not allowed to go to.
Right. Yeah. Give something like that. He said, because I don't know how we're going to manage this. Because you have because the recidivism, oh man, the repeat offenses among that particular class of crimes is very high. Bad. But you can't keep them locked up forever, although there are some things called civil commitments where they do that in the case of certain offenders, where it's like, yeah, the guy actually says, oh yeah, I'm going to do it again.
Right.
And so they keep them locked up. But for the rest who are sort of borderline, what do you do? And as it turns out, that whole law is being rolled back jurisdiction by jurisdiction by lawsuits by guys who are running afoul of this thing and saying, look, I've got a right to live somewhere.
Have you ever Googled my name and sex offenders?
Oh God, no. Should I?
Yeah, it was actually a pretty good story. So
okay.
In 1996, the feds passed Megan's Law.
Right.
So Megan's Law was named after a young girl named Megan. I forget what her last name.
Kanka, I think.
Yes, I think that might have been in New Jersey, who was molested and murdered by a repeat sex offender who
Right.
lived in her neighborhood.
Right.
And so the feds passed a law and said every state needs to have a version of Megan's Law where we let people know who these molesters are.
Right.
And the way the feds do things, they were like, or we'll take away your highway funds or something, right? I mean, that they were pressuring the states. So California did passed a very, very watered down version of Megan's Law. They created the list that was both high risk and low risk regular sex offenders and high risk sex offenders.
Mm-hmm.
And what that meant was the high risk ones. So if you were in college and you pulled your pants out and winged your ding dang at somebody, you could actually be on the normal sex offenders list. To get onto the high risk sex offenders, you had to be guilty of at least 5 crimes against children over at least 2 trials. So you had to be pretty fucking bad at that point.
Yeah.
But what California did, because even in 96, California's legislature was a bunch of wussies then too. They said, okay, we're going to pass this thing, but for you to get that list as a citizen, you had to go into your sheriff's department or your large city. You had to sign something that says, I promise that I won't, throw rocks at any sex offender's house. I won't use this, blah, 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 blah. You had to sign something pledging not to tell anybody about this information, which I'll come back to because that's bullshit.
Right.
And then you got 15 minutes to look at a computer. And it was a crime to transmit that information. So I saw this and I was like, go fuck yourselves. It's like outside of like the codes to the missiles, there's very few times that the government of in the United States can say it's a crime to give this true information to someone else. What are you doing? Are you Googling me on that? I don't know.
No, I Googled Megan Kanka though, just to, that was New Jersey in 96.
Right. So I got a little bee up in my bonnet and I started going to my local sheriff's department and writing down the list of high-risk sex offenders in LA County.
Mm-hmm.
Their name, their address, and their crimes. And there were thousands of them.
Sure.
And this was in the early days of the internet. And I said, you know what? I'm going to make a website called sexoffenders.net, and I'm going to put all of these names on this list with their towns and that. And if you want to come and arrest me, bring it on. Because I actually believe that the First Amendment applies in California, even if the law says that it doesn't. So it caused a little bit of a shitstorm back then. The first thing, so I kept going and going. Some sheriff's departments were better than others, and most of them kind of didn't care. I learned a couple things about sex offenders. One was they're almost all guys.
Yeah.
I looked through thousands and thousands, and it's probably 99.5% males and 0.5% females. So it's like, if your kid's lost in the mall, don't tell them to go find a cop. Just tell them to go find a female, and they're probably not going to be molested. Another thing, and this isn't good for you and me, there was an overrepresentation of molesters, and these were both of adults and children, but more focused on children, had facial hair.
Oh.
I don't fucking know why, but there were a lot of dudes with beards and mustaches, and it was like you just couldn't not notice it.
Yeah.
You notice some racial things. Blacks were more often to be just plain old rapists. Hispanics were more likely to be molesting their niece or a family member.
Oh.
So you would see some things like that because most of it wasn't what you the horror story that you think of a guy like looking just like you with some this cruising the junior highs. Most molesters would put themselves in ways where they'd be near kids. They'd babysit their cousins or their nephews, or they'd be a swim instructor, or they'd work at the YMCA. I mean, they tried to like who was the guy who said, I rob banks because that's where the money is. They would get themselves near there. So it was fascinating. So I did that, and I announced that I was going to release this out on. You frozen up for a second.
No, it's me.
Nope. Oh, you just froze up.
I did. I was staring stunned at the fact that, having now Googled Ken LaCorte and sex offenders, holy crap, you even made the New York Times.
It's funny, I made Fox News before I'd even heard of Fox News. I was like, what? What's that? Okay. And so the night before I released it, I got a call from an assistant attorney general in California. Dan Lundgren was the attorney general back then.
Yeah.
And they gave me some reasons you shouldn't do this. And I was like, okay, well, why not? And they gave me a bunch of bullshit reasons. It was like, they were like, well, we think that this will help make the law unconstitutional, that a judge will see this and rule Megan's law unconstitutional. And I'm like, okay, look, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think anything Ken LaCorte does can make a law constitutional or unconstitutional. Judges aren't going to, the judges are allowed to use hypotheticals or anything like that. They said, well, this will allow somebody in Florida to come and look at our sex offenders in California. And that might not be right. And I was like, well, who cares? It's
right.
Like, I could read the Miami white pages and what's the advantage of doing that? You don't do that. And then the last thing that they said, which was, well, we think that this is going to be a way that sex offenders can meet one another and like maybe link up and do this. And so I said, okay. So despite the fact that NAMBLA, the National Man-Boy Love Association, exists and has forums out there, you think that like a sex offender is going to go look and he's going to like call up another sex offender and be like, hey, Ben, I see you're a sex offender and I'm a sex offender too. Do you want to go cruise the junior highs together? And I was just like, go fuck yourself. Anyhow, so I did that, and with the full intent, the best arguments for why I shouldn't have done it were actually good arguments. And the argument was, why should you be the guy doing this? You could make up things. You could have mistakes. This is not the way it's done. And I'm like, you're 100% right. It's not the way that sex offenders should be done. It should be done by the state of California. You shouldn't be locking this stuff up in a sheriff's office, because you felt like a pervert. You'd walk in and be like, can I see the sex offenders list? That was not something that most moms and dads did.
Right.
And my wife at the time was like right before I launched this, she was supportive. She said, just so you know, if any one of those guys molests our children, I'll never forgive you. Oh, fuck, thanks, honey. Every single person in my life was like, they're going to take your house. Somebody's going to blow up one of their, but weirdly, it was one of the best things I did in my life. I released that. I got thousands of emails, and this is in the days when email was just of people who were like, wow, I discovered that my kid's swim instructor was on this list, and thank you. I got a lot of stuff like that, and no overall problems that I know of. And eventually, and Jim Batten helped me out on this. That's why I had mentioned him. He helped me out, and then a couple years later, I ran for office, kind of on this issue, and eventually California did that. So right now, it's not in some dork like me's database, that could be hacked or mistakes or all of those things that California said. You know what? People are smart enough that that this is information that's good for them to have, and they're not going to abuse it. They're going to use it to safeguard their kids. So.
And as far as I know, that's been true.
Yeah, I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any kind of like we burned down your house and ran you out of town. I'm very aware of the person on this list moved, didn't do this, is now a youth pastor or a volunteer at something like that, because that's the way that things like that happen. Again, it was very rare that somebody just drove a car, grabbed, do you want candy, little girl, grabbed a kid and moved on. So
yeah, it's a very useful tool.
But literally at one point, if you just type my name into like Google, like it would come up with related terms. It was like Ken LaCorte, sex offender. And I was like, oh, fuck, man. That's not that. But, after like I did that, I had to get out of that world. I was just like, I don't want to be, who's the guy who had the show? Chris. Yeah, that guy.
Walsh.
No, that was another guy. Walsh had a son who was killed.
Who was killed, yeah.
There was another Chris one who would get the sex offenders. It was just like, after a little bit, I'm like, I just don't want to swim in this ocean. I just want to be away from this. So I don't even know what you go to when you type sexoffenders.net, but it's probably a porn site.
Yeah, I'm afraid to do it now.
Yeah, well.
Hold on.
Oh God. I probably should have kept it going. $10 a year.
No, it looks like all it is it's a portal to.
It was sexoffenders.net.
Yeah, and then all that comes up is links to search for public criminal records.
Yeah, okay.
And that's it. There's nothing really.
Oh,
here.
Good. I thought it'd be like all right, so what you do is you pretend to be a girl and you say that you like sprats.
Like a how-to site. Good Lord. Good Lord.
Dude, I remember living in New York when I was at one of the gay rights parades and I saw the NAMBLA guys coming. I'm like, wait a second. I know you're trying to build your coalition, but could you leave the child molesters out of it?
Right. It's weird. It's weird and it's troubling. Wow.
What do we do about the tribalization of American politics? It's never been so extreme in my, I don't know, post 15 years old lifetime.
Right. So, I mean, we've always had it, and
sure.
In the early 1970s, when you were but a toddler, I mean, there were bombs going off.
Yes, when we were kids, it was pretty fucking bad. But from the late 70s on, this is as bad as it gets, or has been.
Yeah, I think it's pretty bad. There's often talk of a cold civil war,
right?
And I think probably the only way this will get resolved in one of two ways. Either there is a existential threat to the country, like China attacks the mainland,
right,
or something, or there's a negotiated what an acquaintance of mine, David Rayboy, calls a national divorce, where people sort themselves out. I've got several friends on
those
social
are expensive
media.
Though.
Yeah, no, they are. Any divorce is expensive, right? And so, but I've got friends on social media who will say, it is practically a duty for you to move to a red state, and we're going to move to these red states, and we're going to build our communities there, and to hell with the blue states.
No.
And that to me strikes me as a bit far-fetched, because as Michael Anton, who wrote the Flight 93 election ahead of the 2016 election, it was a very famous and controversial essay. As he likes to point out, they're not gonna just let us leave. The blues aren't gonna let the reds leave in peace. They're not. They're going to say you're gonna submit and you're gonna like it. And I think he might be right about that. And so I don't see any sort of kumbaya, come to Jesus moment really in the future. I see there being a lot of strife over the next 5 or 10 years until people either get tired of it, or some external factor comes in and requires people to come together and focus on that crisis. Because I don't see this ending in any way other than with a lot of tears. I just don't.
So you talk about the existential threat. I mean, everybody who was of age remembers September 12th.
Right.
right? Where the country was like, yeah, I mean, ironically, back then it was Bush who was the guy who was elected, but he's not my president because Florida and blah 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 blah.
Yes.
Which I still find shocking that everybody's forgotten. I'll never forget when Trump was on stage at one of the debates, and they were like, "So the night of the election, are you fully prepared to say that you lost the election if you lost the election?" And he didn't say, like, have you people fucking lost your minds? Did you not remember 12 years ago when people were holding up hanging chads and lawyers and David Boys and
Right.
when Al Gore took it to the Supreme Court? Did you not remember that? But
Right.
it was like there was mass amnesia in the country. But September 12th, all that was, or September 11th, the evening, all that was forgotten. And it was, we became Americans and we were there. One would have hoped that an existential threat like a flu might have done the same thing, but it didn't. It got sucked into you, me, the finger. We faced an existential threat 2 years ago. We had a disease that came and was going to kill hundreds of thousands, millions, whatever people, and that devolved into the camps as well.
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And I think one of them actually is September 11th, because a couple of things happened after September 11th that, as time wore on, I think more and more people realized that they were rooked. And so one of the things that happened after 9/11 was, yeah, you had a lot of people coming together waving flags, but then you also had Congress pass the Patriot Act,
which I was all for back in the time, like a
fucking, and I think a lot of people were.
Idiot.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were, because they thought we've got to do something, anything. But you know what the Patriot Act was essentially was a lot of legislation that had been sitting around in people's desk drawers for a good long while, in places like the Justice Department and elsewhere, the Treasury Department and elsewhere, saying, wow, we could repurpose this bill that we've wanted for years and say,
call it a Patriot Act.
Call it anti-terrorism measure, and we can pass all this stuff that we've always wanted. That's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was, if you recall, as we were getting ready to go to war in Afghanistan, George W. Bush encouraged people to, keep shopping. So it was a very different kind of war effort. It wasn't this kind of war effort that people had in their either lived through if they were old enough, or had in mind that war requires sacrifice. And Bush's idea of, your sacrifice is to keep shopping, keep consuming. And so people came to realize very quickly that, airport security was just theater. And so, the government will say something on the one hand that this is necessary to guard against future terrorist attacks, but then you see what that is, and you think to yourself, that don't make a lick of sense. On
the other hand, it worked. I mean, if I would have pulled you on September 11th and said, what are the odds that America won't have another mass casualty event that costs us 500 lives? Let's just pick a number out. I would have back then said the odds are 1% that's going to happen, because I could go I could go bomb. Look, you and I are smart enough that with $100,000 to play around with and enough gasoline and 3 or 4 crazy people to be on our side, we could take out a whole basketball center in Indiana, right?
Even less than that. I mean, Angelo Codevilla, the late great Angelo Codevilla, made this argument 2 months after 9/11 in the Claremont Review of Books, in which he said, this is impossible. What the government is claiming that it wants to do is impossible, because, and the example he used was, any halfway organized cell of terrorists could coordinate a simultaneous Molotov cocktail attack on school buses in a major city, and there's not a goddamn thing we can do about it.
Right.
So that was Angelo's argument, and I think he was right about that. I also think that
yet he was wrong.
Yes, and that he was also in some ways wrong.
Well,
but
the fact that it didn't happen.
But his overarching point that a total, totalitarian, but a national security regime like that ultimately comes to the detriment of American freedom. He said, if you want to win a war, to win a war, we don't sacrifice the way we live. We make them change, or we don't change the way we live our lives. We make our enemies change the way they live their lives. And that's not how we really prosecuted those wars.
Well, it was kind of tricky because we didn't know who the enemies were.
Right. Well,
I mean, look, that was the first asymmetrical warfare since the mouse that roared that I recall.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, that sounds about right. But then the other thing is, Ken, is that when it came to the rhetoric of COVID-19 coming from state authorities, and I heard it too, and I heard it before March. I was hearing rumors in February, and we were seeing all those weird videos coming out of China, people collapsing in the streets.
Right.
But it turned out that in a lot of ways, it wasn't as, yes, many people died and many people got very sick and many people are experiencing long-term effects of it, but it wasn't the Spanish flu. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Millions of people weren't dying. And yet we continued to hear really kind of panic mongering rhetoric from authorities at every single level. And I think a lot of people, as time has worn on, even now, people are over this thing. People are, we get to the point where you're seeing New York City cops arresting a guy, a Marine veteran at a Panera bread company because he didn't have his Vax card.
Hey, do you think that burning Vax cards could be something that takes off?
Ooh.
For me, I've had my vaccinations. I was one of the first ones when I could get it. I got what do you call it? Duped up, double dipped at the earliest stage
right.
that I could. But I feel, but I've never used it with the exception of going to Hawaii for a small vacation. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go to Mexico and back. I might use it for Burning Man if they do it, but I refuse to use it to go to a bar, because I think that I'm a participant in the demonization of people who are not choosing to be vaccinated, and I'm pretty pro-choice on vaxes.
Sure.
Do you think that a burning your Vax card could be the bra burning of this generation?
I don't know. For one thing, because I think a lot of people have their information on their phones.
Yeah, but look, a lot of gals had a second bra at home too.
Right, that's right.
So I'm not looking for purity here. I just thought if 30% of the people did that,
that would make an impact. What do you think? What about 10%? Would that make an impact, do you think?
I don't know. It's a good question. I live in San Francisco adjacent, and they love they're wearing masks in their cars. They're wearing masks in the showers. They've convinced themselves that that's the equivalent of being a good citizen. And on some levels, it is. I don't know. Something to think about, though.
I think about the way the policies are enforced or not enforced. Mm-hmm. So I live in San Bernardino County. They're not enforcing really anything. And a lot of businesses have chosen to ignore the latest statewide mask mandate, rather.
San Bernardino's we can't stop crack. We're probably
that's the city of.
We're probably not going to be able to stop a vaccine.
The county is geographically the largest in the United States. There's lots and lots of cities.
It's bigger than a lot of states.
It's bigger than many states.
Probably at least half a dozen states, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You should write an article on that. You live in the X biggest state in the
It's been done.
Okay.
But the enforcement is really loosey-goosey. And a lot of it is some businesses are more hardcore than others, but a lot of places are just we've been doing this now for 2 fucking years. That's, that's it.
See, it's interesting from my point of view. While I won't use the cards, I'm not the guy who would ever walk into a store if they say, please wear a mask.
Right.
It's your store, man. I'm not going to be that guy. Oh, well, fuck yeah. I'm not wearing. Yeah. It's that to me, it's like, you have some rights as a store owner. And if you say wear a mask or you have to wear a blue hat or hop on one leg, okay, I can choose to shop in your store or not.
Right.
But I would never do that kind of a protest.
Yeah.
I
I don't particularly care for those folks.
They seem like assholes.
But the thing about, I don't mind wearing the masks, but I've come to the conclusion that it doesn't make much difference either way. Because unless you've got a good N95 that fits your face and you've got a beard and I've got a beard, and no mask is going to fit our face correctly unless we shave. The efficacy starts going like this. And so
it's like a condom with a hole in it. Yeah. I get it.
So to me, it's largely symbolism. I mean,
and I'm okay with that in some, like on a plane. I was like, you know what? I'm in a tube with a bunch of people, and I know they got HEPA filters and whatnot, but there's a lot of meat near me. I'm actually okay with wearing a mask. But I also find myself hating being part of the theater when I think it's about theater. And it's like, if I was in a close, I want to do the right thing, but I know that if I'm walking down the street and I see people wearing masks, you're like, that's all theater, and I don't want to participate in that unless there's actually a decent efficacy rate and it's doing something.
Right.
Where I actually didn't mind showing my Vax card going to Hawaii, because you know what, Hawaii has the advantage of having 4 airports in the whole state, and so they actually have kept this thing under control because they had points of entry and points of exit, and they take that seriously. Okay, that's a theory, right? I mean that, and it's working for New Zealand. It's working for Alaska. It's undecided whether it's working for Australia. So
at this point, did you have to quarantine when you went?
No, I wouldn't have done that. Well, I couldn't have. I mean, it's like I was. No, so they said, I think they did it. They might have done a temperature thing. They did not do you need to have a test before X hours, but if you showed a Vax card on it, that was okay for them.
I see. Because now that they have these pretty effective rapid tests, it seems to me that you can figure it out pretty quickly. I just had a test yesterday because of this surgery I'm having.
Oh, right.
And they,
part of me says we should all my son had an idea. He was just like, let's just have a COVID party. Get the old people who have a high death rate on this, clamp the crap out of them for 3 weeks in here. We can do that, right? We can, you have to wear the full body suit on that. And the rest of us do what, we go out, we kiss, we dance, we breathe on each other, and let's just get this sucker over with. That's not necessarily the craziest idea.
It isn't. It's just that, it's like the lottery you don't want to win.
Right.
Because you don't want to be the guy who, you did have the complications. I don't know about you, but I mean, I did gain a little bit of weight during 2020, but I've gotten really attuned to just on a daily basis. I take a million supplements. I take huge doses of vitamin D every day. I take a lot of vitamin C, zinc, as much zinc as my body can tolerate, just sort of as a kind of a prophylactic. Because these are all things that at this point in the game, everybody knows that they actually work. And so just doing things to raise my immunity seems like that's a sensible thing that probably everybody should be doing, because it's sort of like common sense.
Right.
And
I think that makes sense. I'm at the point that once I'm vaccinated, I'm just like, if I get it, I get it. I'm not going to worry about it. I don't think it'll be that big of a deal.
Right.
I can sit around and worry about everything in life, and it's just not on my list.
Right. I don't worry about it. Yeah. I don't worry about it precisely. Yes. For that reason, I feel like I'm taking good care of myself reasonably. I'm eating reasonably well. I probably should get a little bit more exercise than I do, but but the point is, this isn't something, I'm not obsessing over it, but I've got a history of high blood pressure, and that's a problem. That's a potential complication. And so I'm just trying to keep the thing at bay.
Yeah, I get it.
See how it goes. I think we're all going to get it at some point.
I think so. And I'm somewhat encouraged by the Omicron variant that it's like, okay, it's very, very contagious and not all that dangerous. It's
Right.
like, maybe that's exactly what we need.
Right. And that's the course of every virus ever in history.
Right.
The thing, because from an evolutionary standpoint, the thing wants to survive. And the best way for it to survive is to become more transmissible, but less lethal.
Mm-hmm. Or at least lethally slower.
Right.
Giving you enough time to spread it on before it kills you.
Right.
Hey, so what's going on at AM Greatness? So this was a site that kind of came from nowhere, and it was good.
Yeah.
And how did that happen? And what's your mission there? And what are you working on?
Well, so it happened in 2016, in no small part because of the Trump phenomenon, and it emerged out of a need among there. So three of us founded the thing. Chris Buskirk is our publisher. Julie Ponzi is my co-editor, senior editor, and I'm managing editor. And it all kind of came about because we were casting about for something interesting to do. I was writing a book for somebody at the time, but I was my personal life was changing in radical ways, let's say. And I found myself sitting in my backyard, smoking a cigar, working on this book, listening to music, and sort of not really feeling sorry for myself, but wondering what the hell I was going to do next. And I would get on the phone with Julie and say, we got to do something. We got to figure something out. So at the time, there was a website called the Journal of American Greatness, and it was pseudonymous. But we very quickly
synonymous or
pseudonymous.
I don't know what that word
means. Pseudonyms.
Okay.
It was a bunch of guys writing with Latin pen names.
Got it. Okay.
And we very quickly figured out that one of the chief contributors to that thing was an old friend, Michael Anton. I mentioned him before.
So his pseudonymity kind of sucked.
Well, yeah. Well, it was. Well, they all had good jobs, and they were all afraid of getting fired. But what they were trying to do was create a site that would have some sort of intellectual justification for Trumpism.
Right.
And as their profile was rising, when they were getting written up in the Wall Street Journal and the Weekly Standard did a story on them, they kind of got cold feet and they very abruptly shut the thing down. But Michael Anton gave us the heads up and said, this Journal of American Greatness is going away. And so all of a sudden the light bulb appears. We got to pick this mantle up.
Right.
And so that happened in, I think, late May of 2016. We launched American Greatness on my birthday, July 14th, 2016.
All right.
The first month we had like maybe 10,000 views. Now I get 10,000 views while I'm asleep overnight. Like,
sure.
I mean, traffic is grown like gangbusters. It really came about because we felt that the existing media landscape on the right was not attuned to the shifting political ground. I was not.
So you were a counterpoint to the National Review type guys.
Very much so, because
the Blue Bloods, we went to Yale.
Well, yeah, because National Review had published that Against Trump issue.
Right.
And a lot of people were, thought that was foolish. And it just seemed to us that there was really a crying need for a different way of looking at, a lot of people.
Were you a hardcore Trump guy?
Well, no, that's the thing.
Right.
That's among the founding group. I was the one who was, I would even from time to time have described myself as never Trump, but I ended up voting for him. And I changed my mind at the last minute to vote for him. And I wrote about it in a piece on American Greatness, saying I think the title was something like, I wasn't going to vote for the son of a bitch, but now I am. And here's why.
Right. Right.
And what really kind of pushed me over, because, again, you live in California, your vote doesn't count. But I was just going to abstain from voting, but I ended up voting for him because just the by the weekend before the election, the rhetoric coming from the left was so outrageous. I just felt like I had to stick it to those fucking people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That people needed to be, we needed the disruption. You know, Trump, conservatives made the case that Trump is not a conservative. They were right. He wasn't a conservative. He was a disruptor. The problem was,
I viewed him as a hand grenade. I'm like,
yeah, I called him a wrecking ball.
I was actually like, I actually feel like throwing an honest to God hand grenade into Congress. This is the best way that doesn't kill people. Maybe
we felt, and when we launched, we had an editorial statement sort of explaining what we were trying to do, and that was titled "Our Declaration of Independence from the Conservative Movement," because you know what has happened over time with the conservative movement. It's really come to mistake policy preferences for matters of high principle. And it's also come to mistake talking for doing. Mm-hmm. And so in our editorial manifesto, we basically said, look, we're actually editorially agnostic about, Trump, really. We saw him as a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And that end was really a revival of politics rightly understood. Politics is not, as Aristotle might say, the city and speech. Politics requires action. Mm-hmm. And so we thought that Trump would be able to, if not get everything he wanted done, he would at least be able to disrupt the Beltway conventions enough to open the door for certain good things to be done. And immigration was a big one. Renegotiating those trade deals was a very important thing. Mm-hmm. And reasserting a kind of America first foreign policy, which he did. And you didn't have to like the tweets, you didn't have to like some of the rhetoric, but the results in many cases, not all, but in many cases were pretty good. So
that's the mind fuck, right? It's like, I can't think of a whole lot of policies that they had that I was like, oh, that's crazy. I mean, most of them were like, it's about time for that. And they did pretty well on a lot of them, not all of them.
Yeah.
But then as I think, it's like, would you want a kid to grow up to be Donald Trump? It's just interesting because I spent some time with my extended family, and I'm, where I live, I'm a radical conservative.
Sure.
Among other parts of my family and extended family, I'm like the liberal weird guy over there.
Yeah, I bet.
Oh, he does some drugs and he goes to Burning Man, and we're not sure about Jesus. And I asked him, I'm like, and it was a question they all had to pause for. It's like, would you want your boy to grow up to be like Donald Trump? And that's a fucking hard question to ask a father or a mother.
You would want,
the concept of somebody who saves American democracy and who's stopped some really bad things from happening in America. I'd like that.
Sure.
But the guy who's like blowing his nose at people and doing all,
yeah,
that I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I came to appreciate his strengths more as time went on, but it was also clear from the beginning of the administration that he was going to be in trouble. And it wasn't just that, the feds, that whole thing with Michael Flynn and talking.
That was something. That was pretty bad.
That was bad, but beneath it, it was pretty clear by April or May of 2017 that he was not getting his people in jobs in the administration.
He got Omarosa.
Yeah. Or as I was about to say, or he was picking the wrong people.
Right.
And he was getting really bad advice on personnel. And then we reported, and we had, and we heard a lot that just, people who had worked on the campaign, who had volunteered in states, who then, tried to apply for a job, and, their applications went nowhere.
Right.
And once we started hearing that, I thought, oh, this is not going to go well, because he's going to be sabotaged from within. Yeah. And that's pretty much what ended up happening. in a lot of cases.
Execution was not their strongest point.
Right. No, it wasn't. And look, I mean, the greatest example of that is how they handled the results of the election. I mean that they did not have a rock solid legal team in place weeks in advance is scandalous.
I lose most of my conservative friends when they ask about the election, because I'm like, and I haven't followed it all that closely over the last year, but in the weeks that followed, I dug into it. I put on my investigative reporter hat and jumped into that stuff, and I never saw it. I read the Kraken from that. Who's the idiot woman who I'm thinking of? She helped Flynn. She got Flynn off. I mean,
Right.
Flynn was an innocent man who was set up by the federal prosecutorial apparatus of the United States government, and she got him off, as
Sidney
he should
Powell
have been. Sidney
is her name.
Powell.
Sidney Powell.
But did you ever read any of the shit she filed?
No.
Dude, it was retarded.
Yeah.
It was literally like, I mean, remember she was like, these computers, I'm going to prove that from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock a.m. they turned this and they stole this and they did all of that and these two companies ruined and the Kraken is coming.
Right.
Okay, Lynn Wood, I was a huge fan of. I mean, Lynn Wood's done some impressive things in life. His epitaph will have some good accomplishments. But then I read the stuff that they put in, and I'm like, you got to be joking me. This was, I mean, literally her Kraken was some military attaché who 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, worked in Venezuela and saw that the Venezuelan government then used similar type of software, not the same companies,
Right.
but this company bought part of it and did something kind of similar to this. Yeah. And they stole the election. And you're reading this and you're like, this is the stupidest fucking thing I've ever read. And Rudy Giuliani had some similar things. It's like, I lived in New York pre-Giuliani, and I did the direct mail for his first campaign. I mean, it's like I've debated Rudy Giuliani in Roger Ailes' studio. I mean, it's like I loved him, but I read like his Arizona. It was the Nevada one, and it was like, well, this guy says that 20% of the votes are people who've moved or this or that, and therefore we'd like all of these votes to be attributed to Donald Trump and the election to be overturned. And it was like,
no,
I'm not a lawyer, but this shit doesn't work. It was embarrassingly thin, bad, stupid. And I'm not saying that they haven't found better stuff since then, which I haven't followed all that closely. And I'm not saying that it didn't happen. And I'm not saying that the press should have looked into it, but they were like, whatever, hey, Donald Trump lost and we're all happy and look, a Kardashian. But it just wasn't there. And it was tough.
I do believe that probably 80 million people voted for Biden. I can believe that very easily because I think the campaign was such and the messages were such that it was all dump Trump all the time. Mm-hmm. He's a threat to the fabric of our republic. He's a menace. He's a would-be dictator. He botched COVID.
Well, and look, he did lose some old people at that point, and that's it's not good when you're Republican and you lose 20% of your old people because of COVID. That's a problem.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that actually factored in.
That was the constituency that killed him. I mean, he had more blacks, he had more a lot of ethnic subgroups, but he lost old people. Yeah. I'm sorry, you were making.
No, it's just that right. I mean, but I found it perfectly believable that even though Trump got, what was it, 7 million more votes than he did in 2016, I found it perfectly believable, given the hysteria of the 2020 election, that more people would have voted for Biden. And now that they're having buyer's remorse, I believe that they saw Biden as a means to an end, and the end was what they thought would be something like normal life.
Right.
And we haven't gotten it. Those promises, I think a lot of people thought that Biden would get a handle on this virus and people would be able to return to something like their lives before, and without the craziness of the Trump administration.
And some of them just thought, we'll go through 4 years of not hating each other and screaming at each other and throwing rocks at each other.
Yeah. Now who's being naive?
Yes, Kate.